Hi, my name's Steve Pannifer and I'm a director at Consult Hyperion, and I'm delighted to be speaking at this year's Authenticate Summit. And what I'm going to do over the next 20 minutes or so is talk about some of the main things that are happening in the digital identity space at the moment, as I see it. But what I thought I'd start by doing is just step back and reflect a bit on where we are with digital identity at the moment. Often it still looks like this. Every organization that we deal with online tends to have their own version of our identity. They build that identity by collecting information from us when we sign up to their service, and then maybe they give us a user ID and password that's specific to their service. And so we end up with this situation where we have these fragmented, siloed identities with all the different organizations that we deal with. So my car rental company, my university, my employer, my bank, the hospital, all of these organizations kind of deal with this differently. And this creates all sorts of problems for us. Firstly, there's a huge amount of duplication and inefficiency in this process. Secondly, it creates security issues for us. If our data is breached in one organization, then that puts us at risk with other organizations that we deal with. And then, of course, there's issue. We don't have proper transparency and control over how our data is being used. And often this is how it is today. There are some places where things work a bit better, but for most of us, most of the time, this is how digital identity is. So what do we want it to be like instead? Well, we want it to be something like this. It would be much better if that data about us, we had some kind of control over it. If we kind of were in the middle, controlling and owning that data and seeing how it's being used. The organizations that we deal with, of course, they still need to have data about us, but the data that they would hold would be specific to the service that they're giving us. And we would avoid that duplication of data around the ecosystem. So, for example, the driving license authority, they would hold my driving license. That's an important piece of information that they hold and they manage for me on my behalf. But if I needed to share that information or some part of that information with another organization, like the car rental company, then I would be able to do that, and I would have visibility over how that would happen. And of course, that would result in much greater control and transparency to me. It would reduce some of that friction where I'm constantly having to think about managing data across different organizations, and would avoid some of those difficult security issues where we have honeypots of data all over the place, and the breach of any one of them puts us at risk elsewhere across the internet. So that's where we want to get to. But this digital identity thing in the middle, what actually is it? Well, digital identity really consists of three things: identification, authentication, authorization. Identification is asking the question, is this person real, unique, and identifiable? And that's something that we have to do. That's a question that we answer when we sign up to a service. They want to know who we are. Authentication is really the process of saying, well, is it that same person again? So each time I then go to use that service, if I'm using it repeatedly, the service provider wants to know, is it the same person that we established the identity of at some point in the past? And those two things together are useful, but often services need to know more about us. They want to know, maybe, are we qualified? Are we entitled to use the service? Are we old enough? There, all sorts of information about us that isn't actually our identity, but it's important for us to get access to those services. Today, or up until today, often a lot of the focus in the digital identity space has been on the left of this picture. It's about determining who the person is, and is it them again? But increasingly, as we move forwards, the focus is moving towards that authorization space. What's all that extra data, all those extra information that we need to be able to share to access services? And this is quite useful because if you think back to where we want to get to, often we don't want to give away our whole identity to every organization. Perhaps sometimes we only want to give away pieces of our identity, or we only need to give away pieces of our identity in order to access a service. So this is the overall kind of big shift that's starting to happen. And we'll talk about that a bit later on in the presentation, perhaps. There's some technological changes that you can see in terms of digital identity technology that are happening that reflect this shift. One thing that's happening is there's a shift away from thinking about accounts more to thinking about wallets. So up until now, often it's the case that you might have an identity provider who you have an account with. You have a relationship with them and they're managing your data, but they get to see all of your data. Your identity provider, for example, could be a bank, it could be a mobile operator, could be any organization. And then you would use that account as the basis for then getting access to other services. But we're moving more towards thinking about wallets, and a wallet would be a container where you can put your credentials, the information about yourself, but only you can see what's inside the wallet. The wallet provider doesn't know what's in it. They're giving you they're managing the wallet for you as a service, but they don't see what's inside it. And so you can see that leads us towards a technology or an architecture where users have much more control over their data, but also it's more about the data and the credentials than about identity per se. Identity is still important, but it's more about the data. Another change that's happening is moving away from perhaps authenticators to authentication credentials. So an authenticate would be something like a biometric or a password or a dongle. It's the what you know, what you have, what you are. It's the way that you kind of access a service. Obviously, this is the thing that FIDO spends a lot of its time thinking about. But if we think about wallets in the context of authentication, if you're using your wallet to authenticate to a service, then what you're actually doing is the wallet has a cryptographic key. That cryptographic key is then being used to sign a challenge response from the service provider, and the wallet authenticates to the service, not you directly. You may, of course, authenticate to the wallet through the use of biometrics or some other means, but it changes the way that authentication works. And so this is another change we can see in terms of technology. So we know what the problem is. We know where we want to get to. We've got lots of technology to help us do that. So why is that digital identity not really taking off? Why are people not adopting it quicker? And there's a number of reasons we could point to for that. But the thing I want to focus on in this presentation is governance, because governance has been a significant gap in terms of enabling digital identity to really become kind of ubiquitous and adopted. What is governance? Well, governance is all the rules that you put in place to make sure that you know how the digital identity system is going to work. If you think any digital identity transaction, by definition, involves multiple parties. There's the service provider that wants to establish something about you. There's you, the individual, that you want to share some information about you. It's your identity. And then there's the organization that's maybe providing that data that's going to be relied upon by the service provider. So at least 3 organizations or 3 parties involved in an identity transaction. And each one of those parties needs to have confidence that that transaction is going to work in a predictable, expected way. The service provider needs to know that the data they're going to get is reliable. It comes from a legitimate source, and it's been produced with the relevant controls around it. You as an individual need to know that your data is not going to be abused or misused or used in a way that you don't expect. And obviously the provider pushing data, providing you data to then pass on to a service, they want to know that their own data protection requirements are not going to be compromised by providing you data into this identity ecosystem. You can think of that all under the term trust. All of those parties, all those participants need to know that they're protected in the environment. They need to know that if something goes wrong, there'll be recourse. So governance, those rules need to be in place in order that everyone trusts what's going on. Of course, we don't only need trust, we need interoperability as well. If I had a digital identity and I went to a service and they said, oh, I'm terribly sorry, that's not the right kind of digital identity for us, we need a different one. Well, that's no good to me. I want a digital identity that's going to work ubiquitously whichever service I go to. And so those rules need to define interoperability so that whichever digital identity I happen to have, I can be able to use it where I need to. And then last of all is inclusion. So digital identity is not a means in itself. It's not like an end in itself. It's a means to an end. And the end that it's serving is all of those services that I'm trying to get access to digital identity is enabling me to do that. And what that means in different contexts will mean different things. So, for example, if I'm trying to access a government service, well, the government needs to provide access to the entire population, to all of the citizens that it's serving. If, on the other hand, I was a professional trying to get access to a professional network, then that only needs to serve the identity for that context, only needs to serve professionals. But of course, to be inclusive, the identity system needs to serve the people that are trying to access the services that are being served through the identity service. And the rules need to make sure that happens. So this is what governance is about, and it's an area of significant interest at the moment. There's lots of work going on in this space, and I'm going to spend a bit of time in the second half of this presentation talking about some of the places where there's some really significant work going on in the area of governance. But before we get there, just to make the point that the governance covers three things really: regulatory, commercial, and operational. The rules need to cover regulatory things, commercial things, and operational things. Sometimes people use the terms business, legal, technical, because that's BLT, which is kind of easy to remember. But I prefer regulatory, commercial, and operational, particularly because the technology part, isn't really broad enough. What we're interested in is not just the technology, but how the technology is operated. And so we need rules across all of those three things in order for identity ecosystems actually to work. So what's happening? Well, the place to start is the European Union. They have a thing called EIDAS, which is a legal framework for mutual recognition of national digital identity schemes. So the idea here is, if I've got, for example, an identity issued to me in Italy, that identity will be recognized elsewhere in Europe. So if I go and try and access a service in Germany, that German service will, through the rules that they've set in place in the EIDAS framework, that German service will be able to recognize my digital identity, and I'll be able to access that service. And those rules cover regulatory. There's some commercial things in there, some stuff about liability in there, which is commercial, and there's a lot of rules around operationally how to make this thing work well. So they have this framework in place. So does that mean that digital identity in Europe is sorted and that it's flourishing and growing and everything's great? Well, unfortunately not. And there's a few reasons for that. One reason is that the EIDAS rules that have been put in place really only apply at the moment to public sector services, so accessing government services. Another reason is that the rules that they've put in place really only talk about identification and authentication. They don't talk about authorization. So there's no way at the moment with the EIDAS framework for you to share anything beyond your basic identity, so your qualifications or your entitlements, those sorts of things. But the European Union is looking at changing this. In fact, just recently on the 3rd of June, they published a proposal to update the EIDAS regulation. So we'll have to wait and see exactly what happens and the timing about that. But they're looking to exactly fill the kind of gaps that I've just talked about. They're looking at seeing how they can expand out beyond the public sector to support services in the private sector. So when you sign up for a bank account, you may be able to use an identity that's regulated under the EIDAS framework to do that. They're also looking at moving into credentials, into data, so that authorization column that I mentioned earlier. And they're talking about doing that through the issuance of wallets, getting member states in Europe to issue digital wallets to their citizens, where those citizens can collect things like digital identity information from government and perhaps from elsewhere to enable them to then transact fully in the digital economy. So what's happening in Europe, really interesting, and we'll have to wait and see how that pans out, but certainly something to keep an eye on. Second place to go is Australia. So Australia has a thing called the Trusted Digital Identity Framework, TDIF, which is a set of rules that were defined by an organization called the DTA, the Digital Transformation Agency, which is an agency of the government. and that agency's role is to enable digital enablement of government, to make everything digital. But what they have done is they've created the framework, which has put in place a set of rules around how digital identity should work in that context. And in parallel with that, they're building an identity infrastructure. So the rules in TDIF really describe how the roles and responsibilities should be met for delivering that particular identity infrastructure for government. But the rules are strictly separate. And so what the Australian government, and those rules, I should say, are operational more than anything else. So they're talking about things like, what should an identity provider do? How do you manage privacy? How do you manage security? Those sorts of things. But what the Australian government recognises as well is that the identity problem goes far beyond federal government. And so they're looking at how they can expand and extend the Australian approach into state government and territorial government, and also into the private sector. They're looking at giving a legal footing to the TDIF, to the framework, and to enable it to be expanded out beyond the current kind of fairly narrow scope. As to whether they will move into to the authorization domain, currently it's mainly focused around identification authentication. We'll have to see. I think currently the framework does allow for like an attribute provider role, but of course, you know, it's important for the reasons I've explained earlier that they do make sure they consider the full scope of the problem that we're trying to solve here, and I'm sure they will be thinking about that. Third place to go is the UK, which is where I'm from. So in the UK, we've had a fairly rocky road when it comes to digital identity over the last 10 years. We had an initiative called gov.uk Verify, which I'm sure some of you will have heard of, and it was an attempt to create a digital identity system for government that was then going to be taken out into the private sector. For a lot of reasons that I can't go into today, it hasn't really panned out as expected, and they're actually looking at decommissioning that particular scheme at the moment. However, but of course, you know, what that means is we still have this gap. We still need to have the rules in place to enable digital identity systems to grow and to work in the UK. And so what we're doing in the UK at the moment is the government is writing a set of rules, a baseline set of rules, and their intention is that will then kind of provide the shape on which schemes can be built and developed, and over time we'll start to see schemes kind of brought into identity schemes introduced into the market that will work because those rules are in place. That framework is still, you know, very much in the early stages. There's a number of iterations that need to happen, so we'll have to wait and see how exactly what shape that takes. Certainly, they've said it's going to include some legal basis, so have some regulatory elements. A lot of it's operational, and there's discussions about whether it should cover things like liability. Last but not least, we should go to Canada. So Canada have a thing called the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, which has been written through an organisation called the Digital ID and Authentication Council of Canada, the DIAC. And for about 10 years, actually, the community, which consists of some government bodies, both federal and provincial, and numbers of organisations in the private sector, banks, providers in the identity space, have been working and discussing on how can we put in place a set of rules to enable us to have a framework against which we can measure ourselves, so that we can then get to this point that identity can start growing, digital identity services can start growing in Canada. They published the 1.0 version of those rules last year, and they've got the certification program starting to take off. What the Canadians have done, or what the PCTF does, which is slightly different to some of those other approaches, rather than thinking about a specific kind of identity system or a specific way of doing identity, what they've done is written rules that are kind of outcome based. So rather than say these are the kind of roles and responsibilities, or these are the functions that you have to have, they've written the rules to describe what the end result should be, and then of course that ought to mean that the rules are relatively agnostic to, you know, the particular kind of technologies or ways of doing things. So that's quite an interesting approach, and again, one to watch. So lots of work going on in governance around the world, and I've just picked on four countries where there's a lot happening, but there's other things happening as well. But what I wanted to do is just leave you with three really important questions. So the first question is this. So we've talked about what's happening in terms of country by country, and you can understand why countries are doing that, because often there's contextual things within a particular country. The governments of countries are interested in making sure that their own digital economies are able to flourish. But of course, there are global initiatives. I mean, FIDO is a great example of one such thing, with a set of standards around authentication, with a set of governance rules and certification in place. How do those global standards fit into what these countries are doing, country by country? First big question that still needs to be answered, I think. Second question, there's a lot of initiatives around open data. So in Europe, we have an open banking framework. Actually, is based in law. It's a regulation that has then caused the banks has required the banks to create open banking. There's similar things going on in Australia, a thing called the Consumer Data Right, which is broader than financial services. And there's work in other countries in North America, for example, industries looking at how to do open banking. Open banking and identity are really closely related. So open banking or open data, you need to be able to authenticate who you're dealing with, so that the access to that data is only given when the user consents to do so. But also, obviously, the data coming out of those organizations involved in those initiatives, so bank data, can be really important data to input into an identity ecosystem. So the interplay between open banking and digital identity governance rules is an important question that still needs to be answered. And then last but not least, we can't not mention the global brands. So there are big global platforms that have huge reach across the internet. You could probably also include some of the global card payment networks in this space, huge reach and influence in terms of what they do. They're operating at a global level and looking at how they can make their services grow and be more accessible or whatever. But of course, they have something to say in the identity space too. And so if we're working at a national level in terms of governance, how does that relate to what the global brands do? It's a really important question. Again, one that still needs to be answered. So the final question I want to leave you with is just reflecting back to where I started in this presentation about the fragmented situation that we have in digital identity at the moment, all those silos of identity that we still have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. How long is it going to be until we have ubiquitous identity systems, till we solve that problem, till we get to the goal, get to where we want to get to? And I don't think anyone has the answer to that. But I think what we can say is that if we have the right governance rules in place, if we can complete the work of building those governance rules and creating the frameworks to allow identity systems to exist, then what that will do is that will encourage adoption, because people will know that they can trust the systems, that the identity systems that they're using. They'll know that they're interoperable, and they'll know that they're inclusive to meet their needs.